What's up, guys? I'm Brandon Belcher,
And this is Michael Leon.
and today we're going to be talking about spruce budworm population models.
Our teacher is Dr. Urke.
So, first off, let me give you some background information about the spruce budworm. The spruce budworm are the larvae of Corstonera, which is a type of moth that tends to live in the eastern United States and Canada. They reproduce rapidly and can lead to rapid deforestation because the worms eat the leaves of the trees to grow, most often leaving the trees to die. Ludwig, Jones, and Hollings, famous mathematicians, created the model that we used for our own research.
In 1977.
So the first recorded U.S. outbreak was in Maine in 1807. Second outbreak in 1878. Now, there have been several recorded outbreaks since 1909, and balsam fir trees are not the only type of trees eaten, but they are eaten most often by the spruce budworm. As you can see in this picture, the leaves have been eaten off, leaving discolored trees with empty branches. So here are some of the assumptions we had to make so that we could use our model. The worms will only be eating the coniferous trees and will only be eaten by the birds. Worms reproduce at a constant rate and reproduce faster than the trees. No extra worms will be introduced into the system once we start our model. Likewise, no extra worms will leave our system, except through death, of course. The birds will behave normally and have several sources of food, meaning that they will not single out the worms. The population of birds also have to stay semi-constant. The birds cannot be coming or going away for this model to work. So here is the general model for the change in the spruce budworm population over time. There are several constant variables that modify the equation, each representing some real quality of the system itself. dB over dt represents the change in worms over the change in time. RB is the natural growth rate of the spruce budworm. This is how fast it naturally reproduces, taking into account things such as proximity of the worms and how long it takes for them to be born. KB is the carrying capacity. This represents the limit to the amount of worms there can be in a system due to the availability of natural resources. GB is the function representing the predation of the worms. In our model, this represents the birds eating the worms over time. At low prey levels, the level of prey being eaten and prey density are increasing linearly. The spruce budworm's predation model is a Hollings type 3, which creates S-shaped curves in the population graph. This is the survivorship curve. It is a graphic representation of many organisms in a population that are expected to be alive at any given age. There are three main types of these curves, types 1, 2, and 3. Type 1 curves are for organisms that do not often die early in their life, but die often towards the end of their life expectancy. They are usually large mammals like humans. Type 2 curves are for organisms that die more evenly through their life. These would be organisms like birds and mice. What is in our model is a type 3 curve. These types of curves are reserved for organisms that die most often towards the beginning of their life, but whose survivors can go on to live for a very long time. The problem with the model we had is that there are too many variables. It is very difficult to find enough data to create 4 different accurate variables. To solve this, we will scale the model, changing these 4 variables into 2 variables. By doing this, we also eliminate the units, creating dimensionless variables. Now we will only have to deal with R, being the reproduction rate, and Q, carrying capacity. For our test, we will let Q equal 10 and keep it at 10, which is to say we will be performing our analysis on the same forest with the same carrying capacity, 10. We will let R vary to see how the varying reproduction rates affect the total population over time. So the first part of our analysis is the bifurcation analysis. With our ODE, we will set it equal to 0. After we do this, we can create an implicit plot in Maple. We will be using Maple a lot in our analysis to help us graph our model under various conditions. With this implicit plot, we can figure out where the bifurcation points are located. The bifurcation points separate different regions of behavior, meaning that we will want to analyze the model at each different state to see how it behaves and what that can mean for us.
As Brandon said, the bifurcation analysis can divide our system into different regions of behaviors, giving us 5 different cases. For the implicit plot, you'll have to look at it with the vertical lines to see how we get these different cases. At first, we have a vertical line that intersects the plot in the middle a single time. And then, once it intersects it twice, that creates a second case. And then, anytime it intersects it 3 times, that's case 3. And then it intersects it twice again, which is case 4. And then, at the end, it just intersects it 1 time again, which is case 5. Now, as you can see, the implicit plot can be represented a different way, as you can see with these plots around it. There's 2 different graphs on each of these smaller graphs. Here it can be easier to visualize the different regions of behavior. Every time the blue line intersects the red line, that creates a different region of behavior for our graph, and each one of these represents a different R value. As we increase the R value, the blue line starts to move up and intersects the red graph a different number of times. What this means for our system starts to make a lot more sense once you look at each individual case. So, when we set R equal to 0.25, which is a relatively small reproductive rate, the blue line only intersects the red line a single time, which creates 2 different regions of behavior. Anything to the left of that intersection is region 1. Anything to the right of that section is region 2. What this means is, depending on our initial conditions, that changes what 2 regions our graphs start with. So, to the left of, between 0.25 and 0.26 is our critical point. So to the left, if we initially start with 0.25 worms, since this is unitless, it's kind of arbitrary, but just keep in mind this is a very small amount. If we start with 0.25, you can see the population over time slowly increases to about 0.3, 0.26, and levels off and just stays there. If we start with 0.26 worms in our forest, the worms have to die off because they're above the carrying capacity, and they drop down to about 2.599, and they stay there. Now, we can go on to case 2. Case 2 is an R value of 0.38397. This one is interesting because it's the exact number you need for the blue line to intersect their graph exactly 2 times. This creates 3 different regions of behavior, so depending on what our initial conditions are, it'll start in one of those 3 regions. If we start with something pretty low, like 0.4, now you can see that the graph levels off at a higher number. We get more worms. It goes up to about 0.44 or 0.439 and levels off. If we start with 4 worms, somewhere in between the peak of the red point and where it intersects with the blue line, our graph actually goes down because we have too many worms, and it levels off at about the same thing. And if we start with 6, the same thing happens. It goes down much faster and levels off to the carrying capacity. But this one's a little different because it takes a little longer for it to level off. Moving on to case 3, we increase the reproductive constant again to 0.5, and now we have 3 different intersections, which create 4 different regions of behavior. And you could probably start seeing a trend now where the amount of regions of behavior are 1 more than the amount of intersections. But anyways, this time starting with 0.5 as our initial starting condition for the worm. As you can see, the carrying capacity has increased again, leveling off now at 0.68. Keep in mind that our carrying capacity in the equation was set to 10, so every time we increase R, we're slowly creeping closer to that 10. If we start with 1.5, we go back down to 0.68. We start at 4. We actually go a lot higher this time and go to 8. Now, this means that the worms are there's a lot of worms in the forest relative to how big the forests are. Like, there's a very dangerous amount of worms if it's 8 and the carrying capacity for the forest is 10. So if it's in the sweet spot, if we start with just the right amount of worms in this case, it can actually be pretty dangerous for our situation. But as you can see, if we start with 8, coming really high, same thing happens. So, except this time it dips down back to the same level that 4 went up to. It's just, now we have too many worms. They can't reproduce fast enough, so they die off until they reach that steady state. Here we have case 4. R is 0.5595. And this is a very critical point. Because if the reproduction rate ever goes beyond this point, it starts to become extremely dangerous for our forest. As you can see, if we have 0.5 as our starting, it only goes up to 1.1. Not a big deal for the forest. But if we have 4 or 9, anything higher than the first intersection of the graphs, we go all the way up to about 7.79, pretty close to where we were before. This case is not too different from the last case in terms of dangerousness to the forest. There's a lot of worms, but it's probably not going to kill the forest. There's just going to be a lot of worms in the forest. But this case is very important because this is the threshold case. Any more reproductive than this, and the worms go into case 5. And case 5 is the case we want to avoid at all costs, because that is when things start to become very, very dangerous. As you can see, this is case 5. The graphs only intersect one time now. Again, they only intersect one time, which creates 2 different regions of behavior. One where the worms grow up to their carrying capacity, and one where they die down to it. Very similar to the last ones. Except the difference is, with case 5, is that no matter how many worms you start with, even if you start with a very small amount of worms, they will grow up to a very large amount. They'll grow up to about 8.1, 8.2, very close to the carrying capacity, this is when we start having rapid deforestation. Many trees are dying. The birds can't kill the worms fast enough. It's just no matter what in this case, it's going to be very, very bad. Assuming, of course, that the worms we start off with don't just die right away. They will grow into this, and it will be very, very bad. So, what we've gained from this analysis is that as R increases, so does the total population of the worm. That makes a lot of sense. You know, the faster that they're able to reproduce, the more of them that there's going to be. But the amount of birds always keeps it slightly below the carrying capacity. That's the thing that makes this model different than just the normal logistical growth, is that the worms don't always shoot up straight to the carrying capacity, and you need a relatively large R before they actually start doing serious damage to their ecosystem. The amount of worms, the initial amount of worms greatly impacts the overall outcome. See, the problem with cases 3 and 4 is that while they did have a possibility of getting very close to the carrying capacity and doing damages to the forest, is you need a lot of worms relatively starting off to actually reach that state. And if you had a small amount of worms to start off with, they weren't going to get seriously big, and it wasn't going to be that big of a problem. However, case 5, it's a lot different, because once you pass that threshold of 0.5595, then it doesn't really matter how many worms you start off with. They're just going to keep reproducing, and they're just going to devour anything that comes in their way. All the trees around them, they'll just be torn down. So what we want to take from this is we want to try to figure out any way possible to keep that reproduction rate below that threshold, and as low as we can. If we can keep it within relative means, if we can keep it relatively low, then we can still have the worms in the ecosystem, but they won't completely destroy it. This has been our analysis of the Spruce Budworm model. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something.